Censors thought they had the power to erase these films from history. They raided theaters, hauled away reels, and threatened to shut down anyone daring to screen them. But exploitation movies weren't built to die quietly. They thrived in grindhouses, spread through bootlegs, and became legends precisely because the authorities tried to silence them. What happens when outrage becomes the best advertisement a film could ever have? Let's dive into the gritty list of exploitation movies the censors couldn't kill. Blood Feast, 1963. If there's one movie that taught audiences just how far exploitation could go, it's Blood Feast. Directed by Herschel Gordon Lewis, the so-called godfather of gore, this film was ground zero for shock cinema. The premise was deceptively simple. A caterer secretly butchers young women to resurrect an ancient goddess. But the content wasn't about story. It was about raw spectacle. Audiences weren't used to seeing entrails, torn limbs, and buckets of stage blood splashed across the screen with such blunt force. It wasn't classy horror like Hitchcock's Psycho. This was grindhouse brutality, and it made people faint, vomit, and bolt for the exits. Censors pounced. It was banned outright in the UK, raided by police in American cities, and denounced as a corrupting influence. Critics branded it amateur trash and the worst movie ever made. But Lewis understood something the censors didn't. Outrage sells. Posters advertised it as nothing so appalling in the annals of horror. And the controversy drew bigger crowds. Nurses were placed in theater lobbies to treat overwhelmed viewers, a gimmick that only heightened the spectacle. On a tiny budget, Blood Feast raked in over $4 million in grindhouses, proving shock could be profitable. In the end, the very attempts to erase Blood Feast made it immortal. What was dismissed as junk became the blueprint for the entire splatter genre. And Lewis? He laughed at the bad reviews, calling them the best marketing he ever got. Love Camp 7, 1969. When Love Camp 7 hit underground theaters, audiences had no idea what they were walking into. The plot revolved around two American women infiltrating a secret camp run by officers during World War II. On paper, it sounded like a pulpy spy thriller. In execution, it was pure exploitation that crossed every boundary it could. Directed by Lee Frost, this film launched an entire subgenre, later known as camp shock cinema, and censors lost their minds. Canada refused to classify it, Australia banned it, and Britain not only outlawed it in 1969, but later placed it on the infamous Video Nasties list in the 1980s. Even decades later, the UK Board of Film Classification refused to approve it, calling it obscene without a shred of merit. But as always, the outrage backfired. Feminist groups stormed screenings, sometimes throwing red paint on screens in protest, which ironically gave the film even more press. In Chicago, arrests were made after activists disrupted showings. The very protests intended to bury Love Camp 7 only fueled its notoriety. Despite never receiving an official MPAA rating, it thrived underground and reportedly pulled in millions from rentals alone. For Lee Frost, the controversy was gold. He never apologized and stood by it as one of his defining works. Years later, filmmaker Rob Zombie called it one of the most outrageous exploitation films ever created. The lesson? Once audiences heard a film was too shocking to be seen, they lined up to see it. Censors couldn't kill it. They built its legend. The Touch of Her Flesh, 1967. Some films wore their grindhouse status like a badge of honor. The Touch of Her Flesh was one of them. Directed by Michael Findlay under a fake name and starring his wife Roberta, the story followed a weapons dealer who, after a freak accident leaves him blind and unstable, lashes out at women with bizarre weapons, knives, darts, even poisoned roses. Cities like Boston and Detroit wasted no time banning it. In Canada, Customs seized prints and labeled it dangerously psychosexual. In New Jersey, a theater owner was arrested for screening it, then defiantly kept showing it anyway. Everywhere it played, controversy followed. The film was never rated, never accepted by the mainstream, but somehow thrived. It did well enough to spawn 2 sequels, making it a full trilogy of exploitation revenge tales. Roberta Findlay later summed it up with striking honesty. "We made filth because filth paid the rent." That statement explains why the film endured. For independent filmmakers, controversy was their only weapon against Hollywood's dominance. The touch of her flesh didn't need critical acclaim. It needed headlines and ticket buyers curious enough to see what the fuss was about, and that formula worked. It may not look like much today, cheap sets, grainy film stock, clumsy editing, but in the 1960s, it was dangerous enough to scare officials into raids and bans. The more they tried to suppress it, the more people wanted to see it. And that's how a low-budget grindhouse film carved itself a permanent place in exploitation history. Olga's House of Shame, 1964. If Blood Feast invented gore, Olga's House of Shame gave birth to another controversial niche, the so-called white slavery cycle. Audrey Campbell starred as Olga, a crime boss who ruled with an iron fist. She punished anyone who disobeyed with ruthless cruelty, turning the film into a blend of crime, dominance, and sheer spectacle. Shot guerrilla style on the streets of New York, the production was bare bones. Many performers were strippers or burlesque dancers working off the books, while Joseph P. Mara directed with a cheap camera and dubbed voices in later. The result was raw and unpolished, but audiences had never seen anything like it. Predictably, censors were horrified. It was banned in Chicago, Boston, and Los Angeles. Britain refused to classify it, and to this day, it remains banned by some boards. Churches and community groups railed against it, claiming it degraded everything it touched, but the backlash worked in the film's favor. It ran for 40 weeks in Times Square, pulling in over $2 million from a $20,000 budget. For an underground production, that was an astronomical profit. People didn't just see Olga's House of Shame. They bragged about having seen what others couldn't. This was the secret weapon of exploitation, forbidden fruit marketing. By banning it, censors turned it into a must-see event. Today, it's remembered less for its plot and more for the firestorm it ignited. It proved that even films dismissed as crude pulp could stand toe-to-toe with the censors and win. The Naked Kiss, 1964. Not all exploitation was low-rent sleaze. Samuel Fuller's The Naked Kiss walked a razor's edge between art and trash. It told the story of Kelly, a woman trying to rebuild her life in a small town after working the streets. She volunteers with children, finds love, and hopes for redemption, until she uncovers the town's ugliest secret and takes justice into her own hands. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Was it a morality tale or lurid pulp? The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned it immediately. Multiple countries banned it. Theater owners in America were warned they could lose their licenses for showing it. In the UK, it stayed outlawed until 1990. The backlash nearly destroyed its chances. Yet time changed everything. Directors like Martin Scorsese later hailed Fuller as a pioneer, and Quentin Tarantino called him the original punk filmmaker. Constance Towers, the star, spent decades defending the film as misunderstood. What once seemed obscene was later recognized as brutally honest filmmaking. Here lies the irony. The Naked Kiss was attacked like an exploitation film, but decades later it was celebrated as an overlooked masterpiece. Censors wanted it erased, but instead their fury preserved its reputation. Fuller didn't make movies to play it safe. He made them to cut through polite lies. And this film proved that even art could be branded as dangerous when it pushed the wrong buttons. She-Devils on Wheels, 1968. Long before biker flicks became mainstream, Herschel Gordon Lewis gave the world She-Devils on Wheels. It followed an all-female biker gang called the Man-Eaters, who cruised Florida highways wreaking havoc on men. This wasn't about subtlety. The women challenged every gender expectation of the 1960s, turning the tables with reckless abandon. Censors hated it. In conservative towns, it was banned as obscene. Theater owners were warned not to book it, and some prints were seized. But the grindhouse circuit loved it, and it played to packed audiences who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Women on motorcycles, fighting, drinking, and flipping the bird to the law. Lewis marketed it with pure sleaze genius. Posters screamed, riding their men as viciously as they ride their bikes. The controversy brought crowds, and what was supposed to be a throwaway B-movie became a landmark in women-led exploitation cinema. It might look campy today, but back then, She-Devils on Wheels was enough to terrify censors, and in the world of exploitation, that's exactly what kept it alive. Vixen, 1968. If one director thrived on controversy, it was Russ Meyer, and Vixen was his crown jewel of defiance. The story followed a Canadian woman whose reckless behavior turned her mountain home into a chaos zone of entanglements. But what sent Censors into a frenzy were the boundaries it gleefully crossed: interracial intimacy, family taboos, and blunt talk about politics. When it premiered, the reaction was explosive. Cities like Dallas, Boston, and Miami banned it outright. Police raided theaters, confiscated prints, and arrested owners. Yet the film didn't just survive the crackdown, it thrived. Vixen grossed over $8 million, running for nearly a year straight in Los Angeles, making it one of the most successful exploitation films of all time. The U.S. Senate even launched an obscenity investigation in 1969, citing Vixen by name. Most filmmakers would have panicked, but Meyer reveled in it. He proudly called Vixen the film that made me rich enough to tell Hollywood to go screw itself. That money and infamy gave him independence no studio could match. Beyond the scandal, Vixen reshaped the legal landscape of film censorship. Court battles over its obscenity charges set precedents for what could and couldn't be shown on screen. In short, it didn't just survive the censors, it rewrote the rules they had to play by. For Russ Meyer, censorship wasn't an obstacle, it was free advertising. Vixen proved that sometimes the best way to sell a movie is to have the government try to bury it. The Wizard of Gore, 1970. Herschel Gordon Lewis was already known as the godfather of gore when he unleashed The Wizard of Gore. On the surface, it played like a stage magician's story. The mysterious Montag performed grand illusions, like sawing a woman in half that stunned audiences. But when the curtain dropped, the tricks weren't illusions at all. They ended in grisly carnage, with bodies torn apart and blood spilling everywhere. For censors, this was too much. Across the U.S., screenings were raided, reels confiscated, and theater owners dragged into court on obscenity charges. Critics piled on, dismissing it as unwatchable garbage. But Lewis was no fool. He took those insults and turned them into advertisements, slapping worst film ever made across posters as if it were the highest praise. The backlash became the movie's greatest asset. Grindhouse theaters sold out, eager to show the picture too offensive for polite society. Word of mouth carried it far beyond its small budget, ensuring its survival even when officials tried to bury it. Fans celebrated the sheer absurdity of the gore, calling it a blood-soaked cartoon rather than realistic horror. And here's the kicker. Decades later, the film's notoriety only grew. Its reputation was so entrenched that it inspired a cult remake in 2007, proving that what critics once trashed had staying power. Dismissed as trash, banned as obscene, The Wizard of Gore turned its flaws into weapons. In the end, its very excess made it unkillable. Another triumph of grindhouse cinema over censorship. The Notorious Daughter of Fanny Hill, 1966. This one pretended to be respectable. Marketed as a continuation of John Cleland's infamous 18th century novel Fanny Hill, the film promised historic romance. In reality, it was a cheap cash-in, filled with corsets, gaudy sets, and enough titillation to send officials running. Distributed by Box Office International, it tricked theater owners into booking it under the illusion of class. But when screenings began, police raids followed. Cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles saw owners arrested, reels confiscated, and audiences left in chaos. In Britain, the censors didn't even bother considering it, rejected without hesitation. But as with so many exploitation titles, the outrage only fanned the flames. Underground circuits kept it alive, drive-ins embraced it, and word of mouth spread. What was supposed to be quickly forgotten instead became a secret badge of honor among grindhouse fans. The brilliance or dishonesty of its marketing can't be overstated. It was sold as art, revealed as pulp, and then banned as obscenity. By trying to be something it wasn't, The Notorious Daughter of Fanny Hill stumbled into notoriety. It proved that even fraud could be immortal if the censors hated it enough. Blood-Sucking Freaks, 1976. If there was ever a film designed to bait censors, it was Blood-Sucking Freaks. Shot in New York under the working title The Incredible Torture Show, it took place in a dingy off-Broadway theater where a sadistic director staged magic performances that turned out to be real acts of torture. Audiences inside the film thought they were watching shocking illusions, while in reality, it was all too real. When it hit grindhouse theaters, the outrage was immediate. Critics called it vile. Audiences picketed screenings and local boards demanded bans. New York's own film reviewers labeled it one of the most repulsive movies ever released. Even the title was censored. Posters had to be pulled because of the word freaks, which some boards refused to allow. But as with so many exploitation movies, the controversy only made it stronger. Drive-ins booked it under different names, underground audiences sought it out, and its reputation grew. By the 1980s, it had become a cult favorite on VHS, its bans turning it into contraband that horror fans traded like forbidden treasure. Ironically, decades later, the same movie once condemned as too disgusting to exist was embraced by cult film distributors and preserved on DVD and Blu-ray. What censors thought they buried had instead been canonized. In the world of exploitation cinema, Blood-Sucking Freaks is proof of the golden rule. The more the authorities tried to kill it, the more impossible it became to ignore. Snuff, 1976. If one film defined moral panic in the 1970s, it was Snuff. Marketed as a movie that actually showed a real murder on camera, it sent censors, politicians, and newspapers into meltdown. Here's the twist. The film itself was just a mediocre biker flick shot years earlier in Argentina. But American producers rebranded it, slapped on a staged ending where a woman was supposedly killed on set, and promoted it as authentic. Police raided screenings. Politicians called for bans. Audiences protested outside theaters. Critics demanded it be outlawed. The entire marketing campaign hinged on the idea that this wasn't just a movie, it was evidence of a crime. Of course, it was all fake. No one was harmed. But by then, the damage and the legend was done. Snuff became one of the most profitable exploitation hoaxes of all time, thriving precisely because everyone tried to ban it. Sometimes the biggest scandal is the one you invent. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. When Miyazaki released I Spit on Your Grave, critics didn't just dislike it, they despised it. Roger Ebert famously called it a vile bag of garbage. Britain banned it for decades. Feminist groups condemned it, and moral watchdogs demanded it be erased. The outrage wasn't just about what happened on screen, it was about how relentlessly it lingered on its subject matter. The story followed a woman brutally attacked, who then takes violent revenge on her tormentors. It was raw, unpolished, and unflinching. Unlike most thrillers of the time, there was no attempt to soften the edges. That uncompromising approach made it a lightning rod. Authorities seized it at video shops, and screenings were pulled from theaters. In the UK, it was placed on the Video Nasties blacklist, forbidden from official release for years. For many, it symbolized everything wrong with exploitation cinema, but banning it only made it stronger. Underground copies circulated, often in grainy form, passed between collectors who whispered about how shocking it really was. By the 1990s, the film had achieved cult status. For some viewers, it stood as a grim story of empowerment, while for others, it was exploitation at its worst. Regardless of where people landed, one thing was clear. Censors couldn't kill it. Their bans turned it into forbidden fruit, ensuring that it lived on as one of the most infamous exploitation films ever released. Last House on the Left, 1972. Wes Craven's Last House on the Left was advertised with the infamous tagline, "To avoid fainting, keep repeating, it's only a movie." That line alone tells you how hard the censors tried to shut this one down. Shot on a shoestring budget, it told the grim tale of two teenage girls lured into a nightmare of brutality at the hands of drifters. What followed was raw, unsettling, and unlike anything Middle America had seen before. The bans came fast. The UK outlawed it. US cities raided screenings and theaters were forced to cut reels to avoid legal action. Critics loathed it, calling it sadistic and degrading. Yet word spread that this was something audiences had to see to believe. The backlash didn't kill it, it made it infamous. Underground copies circulated, and grindhouses milked the controversy for years. Today, it's remembered as a turning point in horror, a film that announced Craven as a fearless voice in American cinema. What censors called obscene, history calls groundbreaking. Faster Pussycat, Kill, Kill, 1965. Russ Meyer was no stranger to controversy, but with Faster Pussycat, Kill, Kill, he crafted something that critics didn't even know how to categorize. Three go-go dancers tear through the desert, leaving a trail of broken bones, wrecked cars, and terrified men in their wake. It was violent, wild, and unlike anything audiences had ever seen. At first, censors didn't know what to make of it. Some countries banned it outright for being too violent, while others dismissed it as cheap pulp. It failed at the box office and looked destined for obscurity. But then, something unexpected happened. Filmmakers and critics rediscovered it years later, praising it as punk cinema before punk even existed. John Waters declared it the greatest film ever made. Quentin Tarantino drew inspiration from its high-energy style. Suddenly, a movie dismissed as sleaze became hailed as genius. Censors thought they'd killed it by limiting its release. Instead, they created the conditions for it to thrive as a cult masterpiece. Today, Faster, Pussycat, Kill is considered Meyer's most iconic work, proof that sometimes the audience hasn't caught up yet to what a film is really doing. It's a reminder that exploitation wasn't always about shock for its own sake. It could also be about flipping the script, giving power to characters audiences weren't used to seeing in control. Faces of Death, 1978. Few films were as whispered about in playgrounds and sleepovers as Faces of Death. Marketed as a documentary, it blended staged reenactments with real morgue and news footage. The result was a patchwork of accidents, autopsies, and grim curiosities that dared viewers not to look away. The censors were merciless. Banned in over 40 countries, seized by police, and denounced as obscene, Faces of Death should have vanished. Instead, the opposite happened. On VHS, it became one of the most rented tapes of the 1980s, passed around like contraband among curious teens. The line between reality and fiction was deliberately blurred, and audiences debated endlessly what was real. That mystique kept it alive far beyond its budget and expectations. Sequels followed, each pushing boundaries further, but none captured the cultural impact of the original. By trying to erase it, authorities gave Faces of Death its greatest marketing hook, the forbidden documentary that they don't want you to see. That tagline alone guaranteed it a spot in exploitation history. Even today, it remains legendary. Not because it's a polished film, but because censorship turned it into one of the most notorious home videos ever produced. From splatter pioneers to underground hoaxes, these films proved one truth. Censorship doesn't kill exploitation. It feeds it. Every raid, every ban, every outraged headline only pushed audiences closer to the ticket booth. What was supposed to vanish instead became immortal, living on in grindhouse legends and cult shelves. So here's the question. Were the censors protecting people or just selling more tickets? Drop your thoughts below, hit subscribe, and join us for the next dive into cinema's forbidden vault.